I have found in the past that I have a difficult time writing slash playing as unreasonable characters. Uh, this is not so much a problem as a player, but when I am DMing. Because obviously, as a player character, I want my character to be reasonable. I want him to be relatable. In the context of D&D, at least, he should generally make good decisions, or what I would consider to be good decisions. And so he should be something that I consider to be reasonable. Some characters more so than others. But when I'm running games or when I'm writing stories, I have this problem with trying to write characters as unreasonable. Not insane, just unreasonable. If you socialize much at all, you've probably run into people like this. People who are just like, they make weird decisions. They make, snap judgments on basically no information. They jump to conclusions. They take actions that just don't really jive with what it is that they claim to be trying to accomplish. It's like their decision making is really weird, and they're not reasonable. Like you can't even like talk them out of their decisions, and they might even acknowledge that what they're doing is not reasonable, but they're going to do it anyways. You cannot convince them otherwise. They're just so set in their ways, and they do things that end up hurting themselves and or others for no reason. These people exist in the world, and there are more of them than you probably would like to think. And so reasonably, logically, they should be in a fantasy setting, or any fictional setting. There should be people like this. I have a very hard time wrapping my head around that kind of psychology. Specifically for stories, I have a hard time coming up with characters. Like, unless I set out specifically, all right, this character is going to be a problem, and they're going to be something that the protagonists are going to have to deal with. Even then, a character like that has a tendency to sort of like lean into insanity, or lean into like they actually have motivations that make these actions kind of make sense. And that is why they are an antagonist, and not just because their decision making is very questionable. But even further than that, when I am running an RPG, always in the back of my mind, there is this like reminder, like, be fair to the players. Be fair. Don't jump dangers on them that are not that are not telegraphed. There should be, like, if there's a surprise at any point, it should be something that maybe has been foreshadowed, or like the whole thing is supposed to be like, oh, someone has gotten a surprise on you, and so this is an antagonist that you should have been aware existed, at least, if not that they are in the area. I'm not saying like never get the drop on the player characters, never do anything they wouldn't expect, but you should be playing fair. Like, there should be a reasonable expectation that they could have detected this danger, with like make perception checks, or stealth checks, or whatever it is. Like the game mechanics should decide whether or not the players are, game mechanics or players' decisions and their own logic should determine whether or not they are taken off guard by the actions of NPCs. And this should not be something that comes out of the blue from nowhere, no warning, and just completely screws them over. But if you think about stories like, say, Game of Thrones, there's a lot of unreasonable characters. I would argue like disproportionate number of unreasonable characters in that story. And you can kind of see the motivations behind each of them, but they all make like really rash decisions. They tend to be very violent, completely disregarding others, just everyone around them, for their own purposes. These kinds of characters are very difficult for me to play as or to write in a story. because it's just not the way that I think. So like even more like I can make an insane character. I can make a character with like strange motivations who then acts on those motivations in a way that makes sense. I have a really hard time doing characters who do things that do not make sense. Or who like cannot be calmed down. Like they will not react to logic. They will not react to reason. They will not react to like things that tactically they should. I think that's what it really comes down to, because I am quite a tactical thinker. I like to think in terms of like overall strategy. What is my goal? How am I pursuing that goal? What are my paths to victory? That's how I usually approach any kind of like obstacle situation, particularly in like board games and card games. Sometimes in RPGs as well, tends to be less so because situations tend to be a lot more muddy in those contexts. But there is a lot of people who do not approach it that way. They're like, I'm going to do this thing because it's, I guess, the first thing that jumps into their mind. Regardless of whether or not that actually pursues their goal, maybe it feels like it does. You have offended me. I'm going to execute you. And like, be damned if the people that you're trying to execute have political connections, and maybe you are making more enemies and making more trouble for yourself in the long run. It doesn't matter. That kind of like very rash, very extreme decision making, like that 0 to 11 escalation in a second. These kinds of characters should exist, and I think it is logical to think that they do in any kind of fictional setting. I have a hard time playing them, and I suspect a lot of other people do too. And not for a lack of imagination, but because of a lack of like a sense of like they don't feel fair. They're not fair. Like the party comes up to an NPC who is powerful. They have, soldiers, they have a lot of wealth, and they do something, or they represent something that NPC does not like, and they're like, okay, well, kill these guys. Just out of the boot. No escalation, no threats. Just guards, kill them. Or even like inviting them in to rest for the night and then having them killed at night. Like these are things that in a like gritty, realistic fantasy setting should happen, but it doesn't feel fair. It could feel out of the blue, even if it's not. It could feel like bad practices for a game master to do these kinds of things. But it really shouldn't, should it? Like, storytelling wise, these things should happen. And I think they probably could. You would need to, during session 0, sort of acknowledge that this sort of thing exists, that the world is extremely dangerous for these reasons, because that people like this are out there and they have the power to do this and get away with it, and so they do. I think there's a tendency to assume that the world of an RPG is sort of like on the same moral level as the players are in real life. And so, you're going to be, so that like the world as a whole recognizes that, slavery is wrong, murder is wrong, theft is wrong. There's going to be a sort of social hierarchy. There's going to be probably a king at the top, maybe a council. You're going to sort of transfer real life values into the fictional world. And I think it's probably for the better. Well, not for the better. That's an entirely overbroad statement. It is more realistic and perhaps more immersive if it is not like that. What if you have a sort of like warlord king who rules over the area, and he is a complete tyrant. Everyone only obeys him because they fear him. That sort of, like, that would be a society that is sort of painted as the bad guys. He's going to be the antagonist of the campaign. You're going to start over here in like the good guy kingdom where the king is right and just, and everything is happy and peaceful. And you're going to go to that place, and you're going to end up having to fight this warlord king in the long run. What if you don't? What if, like, that's baseline society for your world? Historically, that kind of stuff happened. So, this isn't really so much of an opinion piece as it is a musing on the nature of, like, unreasonable NPCs. They are difficult to use in a way that is both effective for illustrating the kind of setting that they belong in, but because they feel inherently unfair, because the world is an inherently unfair place in real life. I think fantasy worlds tend to be way more fair than real life is, and that's an interesting thing to observe. Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. Like, you don't want the game to be a bummer. You don't want the setting to bum out the players, because you're there to have fun. And so the setting ends up being more fair, more, saccharine is an adjective to use. It's more nice than real life is, because historically human civilizations have been brutal in the past. They're brutal now in a very different kind of way. In the past, it was very, like, on the surface. You could see it. Skin deep brutal. That's not what that means. It was very obviously brutal. I'm wondering, like, if it would be a good idea to have a campaign where that kind of stuff happens on the regular. D&D feels like the wrong kind of system to try to address social issues like that. Just because, like, its focus is on, going into dungeons and killing monsters, and not so much on grappling with an inherently unfair, uncaring, difficult world to survive in. PCs in D&D tend to get quite powerful quite quickly. And so they tend to just very suddenly not care about the warlord king and his, 100 guards. Like, it's not a threat to them anymore. There's a sort of assumption in D&D that the party is going to survive to the end of the campaign, or the campaign will suddenly end. And I don't think most people want that, So it's hard to really threaten the player characters with any kind of meaningful danger without it being just a TPK all of a sudden. So anyways, yeah, those are my thoughts on unreasonable NPCs, why they might be good for a campaign, why they could be really interesting, but why they are very, very difficult to use.